So this poem, it's kind of like my life story. Oh, I got books for sale if you guys are interested. Normally they're 15, today they're 10. Here we go. The history of my family was never taught to me. I climbed my family tree like Helen Keller. Deaf, dumb, and blind. Piecing together what it meant to be Mexican, what it meant to be American, in a broken home under joint custody in the historically and still Mexican section of Greater East Los Angeles. My father, raised by the belt buckle, raised by parents who go months without speaking, raised me under the influence of the bottle, under his raised voice, under his raised fist. He raised a stuttering and shell-shocked child, horrified and contemptuous. My mother, raised with love, raised with encouragement, raised a second born, the first generation, born in a new country. A beautiful and curious woman raised me with a library card. Raised a boy genius who had to raise his hand, had to raise his voice, had to raise questions in the historically and still Mexican section of Greater East Los Angeles. I learned how to love, and I learned how to hate, in the same place, at the same time. By 5, I could quote Shakespeare, roll with the punches, identify the instruments of the orchestra and fall asleep to the sounds of gunshots, pretended they were fireworks. The sounds of my father screaming, pretended it was a television under the cover of blankets in the deepest, darkest, loneliest stretches of night. By flashlight, I learned how to read or pretend to be asleep to avoid life. By 5, I'd memorize the names and terms of all the presidents. It became something of an obsession when I proved something to someone, just not sure who. By 8, thinking he'd be proud of me, I told my father I could see myself in that Oval Office before he sat me down and said, "Son, we are Mexican, and this is America. That is never going to happen." The history of my family was never taught to me. I climbed that family tree bitter and thorny. Heard stories how my great-grandfather died sick of the Colorado Blackland. He got slaving away in the coal mines of America. Read a book about something called the Mexican Patriation Act and began to piece together, brought him here, and then would send him back. Well, the story of how my grandfather met my grandmother was made that much clearer, and I began to understand their entire family had been deported from this country in the 1930s for no reason other than their last name and the color of their skin, and I began to piece together how I may never have been born had that never happened. Yes, I have spent the better part of my life understanding that oppression runs through my veins, and that is not history that goes down easy. So the boy genius who would be president now began to hate this country and all that it stood for, and all that it trampled over, the racism that ran my mother's father and drove him from its borders, the poverty and the misery that drove my father's father to become an alcoholic, that bitter legacy that never goes down easy that drove my father and I to become alcoholics. Yes, I hated all of it. It's mindless consumption, it's mindless labor, the pointlessness of moving a box from one corner of the room to another, the misery of living paycheck to paycheck as a mindless slave to next month's rent in a heartless economy that drove me towards homelessness as I slept in my car, under the stars, under a flag, under Old Glory flying so arrogantly over me. I hated the stares of co-workers who knew I had not seen a bed in weeks. Their whispers you could hear had never known what it was to shower in a gas station sink, and I hated the hatred that tore me from my father, the pride that kept me from my mother. And when I lost that job, I shot through my days aimlessly, beaten down by the summer heat like a stray dog, wandering the summer streets, and I remembered all that I was supposed to be, some kind of genius, some kind of prodigy, but now homeless, and I hated this country and all that it stood for, a government supposedly for and by the people that had never had anything to offer me but debt, with jobs that robbed my time and energy of all meaning and value, and took until there was nothing left in this cruel joke of a meritocracy, which now seemed poised, guiltless and indifferent, to leave me to my death. Yes, I hated all of it, but nowhere near as much as I hated myself. And I found myself drunk and debased, barely able to stand, barely still a man, in a walking, talking, drunken coma, sleepwalking through a childhood sanctuary. I found myself drunk at the library, applying for a card. But I came back the next day, and the next, and the next, and the next, and I read, and I read, and I read, and I began to see the true history of this country. The real nature of its economy was never taught to me. and never been a question of peoples or borders or New World Order. And it wasn't the white man, it wasn't my dad, it wasn't my old boss. There was no personal failure, no global conspiracy, no Illuminati, but the very nature of the global economy, the very nature of private property. And I read Marx, I read Engels, I read Lenin, and I began to agree with them. I saw for the first time that I wasn't alone, that it wasn't my fault, that I was a worker, that I was working class, that I was proletariat, and so very proud of it. A boy genius who dreamed of becoming president, who grew into a man much more likely to write his local congressman, demand his resignation, unless he could provide a country worth living in, when free of racism, when free of prisons, when free of the exploitation and oppression of women, when free from the social Darwinism that makes beasts of us all. Free! 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 Thank God Almighty! Free to throw capitalism into the dustbin of history! The history of my family. The meaning of my life. The truth about the world and my place within it was never taught to me. Because there are some things you have to learn for yourself.
Yeah!